this is more of a today kind of whiskey. Now, we used to actually sell barrels to people at Bruichladdich, and we still have about 4,500 private casks here. We always made sure that people had the opportunity to sell the casks back, because we didn't want people to feel like they were trapped with a big kind of debt over their head. It's quite expensive to bottle
So if you buy a
back.
cask, how big is the cask?
When we used to offer it, you got to pick what barrel you wanted.
So you get a small one or a bigger one?
Well, the smallest we offered was bourbon. So you could have a bourbon for £1,300, or you could have a wine cask for £1,600. But like in the original days, you could have sherry butts, you could have Calvados casks, you could have virtually anything that we had at our disposal. But unfortunately, we stopped it in 2012 due to the lack of space that we have for storage. So what happened with this cask is this actually belonged to a group of Norwegian men who had bought it from us in 2003, and for whatever reason, they decided to sell it back to us a couple of years ago. So we've not really got anything like this. With the Port Charlotte whiskey, the oldest one we released was 12 years old. It was called PC12. And the reason we didn't make a PC13 was because we didn't have enough of the stock. And we still don't. So this is one of the oldest casks we've got, believe it or not. And we're only luckily enough to have it because we bought it back from some customers.
Well, I hope you get them a good price for it.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they left happy, yeah.
So what's this one, 2003?
So it's a 2003 Port Charlotte. And
Port Charlotte?
Yep. And it's 62.9% alcohol.
Ooh.
Nice and fiery.
62.9. Yeah.
So it's also full-term Oloroso sherry, so it's had no bourbon influence at all. We like to mature our whiskies in a bourbon and then enhance it in wine or enhance it in sherry. These guys went for a full-term sherry cask.
You could run your car on.
It's worked lovely. It's worked out so good.
It's all down on the label.
Now, what is that called?
This is called a valanche.
A what?
A valanche.
How do you spell that?
V-A-L-I-N-C-H.
I-N-C-H.
Yeah.
Valence.
So it's like a big pipette.
Yeah.
Basically, it's
It's like a big pipette.
That's what he's just said.
Oh, sorry.
echo in here. It's like a Spanish Latin derivative. It means to draw from. So that's where it comes from.
You could use that in Scrabble.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
There's enough to get in your bottles. I think the cask's running quite low actually.
Not getting in my bottle, it's getting in my tummy. Oh, wow.
Oh, take some more.
So this should have gone to Norway.
So this
It
is
should have, but thankfully it hasn't. Oh.
it's clearing the tubes, isn't it?
Oh, this one will do the trick. This one will sort you right out because the weather's not getting any better.
Worried about you.
So,
Very amber, yeah.
because it's been in the sherry cask, all that colour has come from the wood. So we don't add any caramel or anything at Bruichladdich. All the colour is coming from the wood. So our whiskey can be, you could buy the same whiskey year after year, but it could be a different colour. And it's just because we can't control that, basically. So we're not aiming for consistency, we're aiming for quality.
But if you were to blend all the 91s together, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't blend
No,
them.
we would do. So if you use like our old 10-year-old for an example, because it was like a simple mixture, it was 90% bourbon and 10% sherry. That was the recipe for making the old 10-year-old, obviously 10-year-old barrels. So what we do is if we need 100 casks, 90 of them will be 10-year-old bourbons and 10 of them will be 10-year-old sherries. We'll tip them all together and then we'll take a strength reading and we work. What we do then is we work out how much water we need to add to bring it down to the bottling strength. So once all that's done, Adam, the master distiller, comes to the shop and he takes a bottle of the 10-year-old that he's already made, and then he'll go back up to the warehouse and compare that to the new batch that's just been created. And he'll look at the colour and he'll look at the taste and monitor it. And once he gets the taste profile as close as it can be, then it's ready for bottling. And it might not be exactly the same colour. It might be lighter or it might be significantly darker. It's just the luck of the draw, really. There's far too many variables for us to control to make whiskey consistent. When we're buying American oak barrels from Kentucky, this barrel is a Buffalo Trace, but it could have held 5-year-old Buffalo Trace, or it could have held 17-year-old George T. Stagg.
Yeah.
So we don't know the quality of the bourbon from within. Sometimes we get 3 amazing hot summers in a row, sometimes we don't get any. So the fluctuation in heat's really important as well. So there's tons of little minute things that are all part of the fun really for making the
This is
whiskey.
good stuff, this is.
This is grand. Now, I've got a cold, but I remember what this one smells like, thankfully, because it's really not penetrating my nostrils very well.
Clearing mine beautifully.
Excellent. It's 40 ppm, 40 parts per million, okay? So to malt to an exact number is very, very difficult. To get 40 ppm by blowing peat smoke at something is a very, very difficult thing to do. So the way that we make the Port Charlotte is by adding some Bruichladdich barley and some Octomore barley together. And that cuts it down to 40. Same as Lagavulin do. Lagavulin are all automated with the malt bins, so they can select malt to come through till it hits 37 ppm. So everyone's got different ways of doing it. This one here, it's a little bit different than what you might expect from like a Lafroig, for example. A lot of people take Lafroig as their benchmark for an Islay whisky for comparisons of others. Lafroig are using the peat on the edge of Islay, so it's on the coast of the island. It's got a very strong marine influence.
Salty,
Yeah, exactly. So the plant life, the soil, the vegetation, it's all been bombarded by these marine elements for X amount of years, and that does reflect in the malting and the flavour of the whisky. Whereas we're malting our barley using Highland peat. So our peat comes from Aberdeenshire and it comes from Caithness, because our malt floors were removed in 1960. So we have to get all of our barley together, drive it all the way up to Inverness to be malted, and then drive it all the way back. So it's quite expensive. Yeah, it's a long, drawn-out process. It's very expensive, but we've worked with it.
That's why you've got a little a drop here then.
Oh, what, sorry?
That's why you've got a pier here.
Oh, no, it goes by truck.
Oh.
It goes by truck on the Calmac ferry, like you guys. So it just travels up and down the road normally.
That's quite something.
So what that means is it doesn't have that marine influence. It doesn't have that kind of saltiness. It's got a woody campfire smoke. So the smoke's very different in how it behaves as well. And because, again, the light and floral spirit that we have, same stills making it all, the smoke doesn't really come through until the end of the dram. You take a drink, you hold it in your palate for 4 to 5 seconds, and it's not until you swallow the whisky that you get this kind of afterburner of campfire smoke coming through in the background. I'm just going to make myself salivate here. That's what having a cold's all about when you work at a distillery. Now, being very high alcohol, it means that you don't always get the full nose of what's going on, because you're trying to not get your nose burnt off by the alcohol. What I like to do is, if it's a new whisky, I just put a little bit in my hand, and when you generate a little bit of heat from the friction, you begin to get different flavours. So this kind of turns into more of it's almost like a metallic kind of smoke. You can try it if you want, use mine, you don't have to use your own.
That's all right.
But once you start to generate a little bit of heat, the smoke changes, it becomes much more cereal based. You're taking the alcohol away from the whole equation, so it changes altogether, sometimes quite dramatically.
And then you put it behind your ears on a Saturday night.
Well, no, not really, because I don't like big hairy farmers, and you're not going to find a nice woman smelling like that, so it depends.
Sterile hands now.
Now, not only do we not add colour, another thing that we don't do here at Bruichladdich is chill filtering. So a lot of
get the oils.
Yeah, so a lot of distilleries, they actually fill their casks at 63.5%. That's what their new make spirit will be. It'll come out the stills higher than that, but they actually water it down to 63.5. The reason for that is, first of all, if you're selling for blend, then you've got a universal percentage to work with, so it helps you kind of assess the value of a certain volume. The other reason is, a lot of distilleries believe that there's no benefit to filling your casks at a higher strength. So that's why they all fill at this average strength. We actually fill our barrels at about 68%. Back in the old days, that was about 72 we used to fill the casks at, going way back. But now it's about 68 or 69% alcohol that we fill at. And we believe that gives us an edge, because having such a high strength alcohol going in the short space of time at the beginning, it actually draws more from the wood more quickly. So we think it gives us a wee bit of a benefit. But
By the time you take it out, you've lost a little bit then.
You lose 0.7% alcohol per year. So you lose
0.7%
1.7 to 2% of the overall volume per annum, and 0.7% of which is alcohol. So it can be quite a significant amount, because if you mature a whiskey for 40 years and you're wanting to make big bucks, if it drops below 40%, you can't sell it. It's illegal. It's got to be above 40% to be Scotch whisky. So that's why filling at a higher strength, again, it gives you longer to relax and leave it in the barrel, and then you're not worrying 10 years later, everything's at 41% and there's a huge panic on. It means we've got some time to work on what we're doing.
the angel share, isn't it?
It is indeed, that evaporation. Now, what you see around the edge of the glass when it starts to run down, they call them the legs or the tears of the whisky. Now, this is another thing that distilleries do quite commonly nowadays. It's not a big secret, they will tell you, because they have to, is chill filtration. So, after it comes out of the barrel, but before it goes in the bottle, it goes through what's called a micron filter, which is like very tightly packed mesh. And what that does is they chill it down to a low temperature, at which point the oil begins to separate, and then they filter away these oils. And what that does is it stops your whiskey going cloudy. You know, like olive oil does when it gets very cold. It stops that happening because the oils begin to kind of coagulate. It's purely cosmetic, which is a shame, because by removing these oils, you're also removing what people call the mouthfeel. You're removing some of the finish and just the overall character of the whiskey. You're removing some of the whiskey, which we don't want to do. If you're paying a premium price for a premium malt, you want everything in the bottle that was
there for so many years.
Yeah, this has even got bits of wood in it. It's great. Yeah. So what I'll do with this one is...
Nothing floating around in
I think there is actually.
There was in the previous one, there are a couple of bits of...
It's just a piece of wood. I found a fly in it once. What a way to go, eh? So what that oil does is it gives the whiskey like a viscosity. You know, you see the way it moves about, it's very dense, it's got a lovely body to it. But what the oils do sometimes is they keep flavour too well. Now what you can do to that is add water. Some people add water for alcohol percentage, like yourself, just to reduce the strength, make it more manageable. But you can also add water to create a chemical reaction. So it's not a dilution, you're actually opening the whiskey up. So what happens is the water actually breaks the surface tension and it begins to space these molecules out, and sounds like a very, very cheesy cliche, but if you think of a flower garden after a rainstorm and how that smells, it accentuates the flavours and it enhances the floral notes. It does exactly the same for whiskey. What I'll do is I'll show you the oil that you've got in your glass. I'll just use my dram, so I'm not going to get to finish it.
Yeah, you can see it. Totally see it. Yeah, separation.
There you go. So because we've got different displacement levels, the oil sits on top of the water. You can see how it's webbed round there. That's fantastic. That is what you're missing from a chill filtered whiskey. That's what they're aiming to take out. Sorry, I've lost the whole use of one nostril. And what you can do
Have
is...
some more whiskey, quick!
Give me that funnel. And I think what to do now is if you just put your finger into that top band, you'll see how it clings to your finger.
Yeah.
And if you rub it onto this part of your skin, you'll feel that remarkably smooth and oily texture. That's what sticks to your taste buds. That's why you can taste a good dram 4 or 5 minutes after you've actually drank it. It's sticking to your taste buds. Yeah, it's gripping onto the taste buds. Try it with that one, just in the top band, and onto this part of your skin. And you'll feel how remarkably smooth and oily it is.
Oh, I see, yeah.
It's lovely, isn't it? This is the stuff you want to be putting under your eyes and, you know, behind your ears and whatnot.
Oh, totally.
Just in the top band, sir. Try again. Mm-hmm. That was right through. Try it with a different finger.
Just the very top.
Oh, sorry. Round here.
The very, very surface.
Just not right through the liquid. There you go.
That's quite a glow.
Yeah, so once it dries, it starts to give you like almost like a honey, kind of like a toasted oak note to it, which is fantastic. It's got a lot going on.
Well, that's all right. I think Saturday night might.
There you go, sitting in the pub, something. Bruichladdich number 5. You know, that's how it's done over here. So
okay, this is Bruichladdich 2003 Port Charlotte.
Well, it's just Port Charlotte.
Yeah.
So we don't call it Bruichladdich.
Oh,
we just call it Port Charlotte. Yeah. So obviously it's all made here, but to help people understand what they're looking for, it's a different house if you want to look at it. So Bruichladdich is always unpeated, and Port Charlottes are always 40 ppm. So the reason we make Port Charlotte is because there used to actually be a distillery down the hill in Port Charlotte, a mile along the road, and up until about 1924 they made very smoky whisky called Loch and Dall. And when we reopened, we also bought the land and the warehouses. It's a mile down the road.
Yeah.
So we bought the land and the warehouses that used to belong to Loch and Dall, and we now make the whisky here and mature it down there in homage to the old distillery.
So all the Port Charlotte is matured down there?
As much of it as possible. I mean, they've got a lot of it behind you, but we've ran out of space down there. They're so old-fashioned though. This is an old building, but the Port Charlotte warehouses, 2 of them are underground, and they've got the one swinging bulb, you know, with the cage round it, and it's very, very old and rustic with the dirt floors and everything. So there's much more moisture in the air down there as well. And it's unbelievable. The maturation of whisky is different depending on the warehouse as well, because they're all like microclimates really, so it has a huge impact. Scotch whisky, wherever you go, we typically lose around 1.7 to 2%, and that's true for pretty much all of Scotland. Distilleries like Amrut Distillery in India, they actually lose 12% a year of their angel share.
Really?
Because of the climate, yeah. And it's not just hotter, but it's drier as well, so it's soaking more from the wood. So they've got a whisky at Amrut called the Greedy 8, and it's because they can't bottle it any older than 8 years old, or there's nothing left in the barrel. And they've got a place in California called St. George. They're about 5 to 6%. They lose a year as well. So, you know, different parts of the world have to suffer.
Smaller cask, it's a bit greater loss, right?
Or just climate as well. Like India loses a lot more because how warm it is, whereas it's like this here all the time in
But
Scotland.
it matures faster also.
It matures faster as well, yeah. So when you get like a 5 or 8 year old from India, it could be the equivalent in maturation to like a 10 or 12 from Scotland. So it's kind of a linear
Do
comparison.
you still get people with illegal stills here?
Pardon?
Do you still get people illegally brewing whiskey here?
No, not anymore. No, it wouldn't be worth it because you know, like the real distilleries, if you like, there would be no opportunity to muscle in on the competition, if that makes sense. Back in the old days, there was about 33 different distilleries on Islay, and a lot of them were, you know, illegitimate distilleries. If you go down to Port Charlotte to the little history museum, they've got an illicit still down there, a wee tiny one. Octomore Farm used to be a distillery. I'm sure pretty much any farmer who could get his hands on a still considered themselves a distiller. But that's going way back, you know, that was back when whisky was just starting to become popular, so they increased the tax, which upset everybody, so everyone went to make it on their own. And people think Scotch whisky's always had this glamorous background, but, you know, we've only been using American oak since the Prohibition, because that's when this abundance of American oak became available to us.
Since when?
Since the Prohibition, since, you know, it was back when they decided that basically cask makers were, to keep them in the job, they were only allowed to use a cask one time. So that's why all of these barrels come from America. So being America, they just never changed the rules again. So since then, America has had to be selling on all of their casks. Over 1.5 million of them get sent out of America every single year. And it's just because of the laws that were put in place back then. But it's got to the stage now that Scotch whisky is so dependent on it that they can't change it. They tried to. What they'd done a while ago in Kentucky was they allowed locals to come and buy used barrels for, you know, $20, $30. But what happened was people were taking the casks and started to realise that if you sweat the barrel, if you steam it, you get 2, maybe 3 bottles of bourbon worth of liquid coming out the oak. So they were thinking cask sales are going up, bottle sales are going down. What's going on? And they discovered that people were sweating the barrels for what's known as the devil's share, which is the stuff that the cask holds onto when you empty it.